Tonight's presentation, I was just commenting when I walked in earlier this evening, it's a bit different than the presentations I normally give. Far less academic, much more sort of high altitude, what is preservation and how can it be utilized and how should it be utilized moving forward in sort of a modern context. Before that though, maybe just a little bit, excuse me, more intro about my background. I think that my background in some ways really helps frame my experiences with preservation and heritage in general. So, as Tom mentioned, I grew up in East Central Indiana. I grew up right outside of Indianapolis, and I graduated from Ball State University, which is in Muncie, Indiana. And extra credit point, if anyone knows the really famous alumnus from Ball State. Dave Letterman, that's it, that's it. I'm not Dave Letterman, I'm not going to be Dave Letterman tonight, but I graduated from Ball State and then moved to Wyoming, and that's the state of Wyoming, not the county. So I moved to the state of Wyoming where I taught high school social studies, and I coached, of all things, swimming and diving, the big landlocked state of Wyoming and the powerhouse swimming and diving programs they had there at the high schools. And then I went back to get my master's degree in American Studies at the University of Wyoming. And that transition is maybe something I'll get into in a moment. I moved back to the state of Indiana where I started working for Indiana Landmarks. I worked for Indiana Landmarks for a decade and did considerable lobbying at the state level and also at the federal level, and was very content there and thought I would be there forever until I came to Western New York and really fell in love with it. To that end, I have to just say not only thank you for having me here, but also I think a hearty congratulations to this village. And it's congratulations for what you have. And my first experience as an adult, at least, in the Rochester, Western New York metro area is I can recall driving from Rochester south on Monroe during the interview process. That's been 7 years ago. And I remember coming across Pittsford. And instantly, you could tell that this place was different. This place was special. And I'm not certainly downplaying where I live, which is your next door neighbor in Brighton, but it was very clear that there was a preservation ethic in Pittsford. And that's something that I congratulate your elected officials on, and I congratulate all of you, because I know that's a long process, and I firmly believe and realize that it's not an easy process. Secondly, the background of this organization. So the Landmark Society was formed in 1937. So we technically are still celebrating this year our 80th anniversary as one of the oldest preservation organizations in the United States. We're actually, believe it or not, one of the larger preservation organizations in the United States, and we're pretty proud of that. And we do some fantastic work all across Western New York, and I'm happy to be here tonight. So let's try that. So I mentioned that it was going to be a bit of an unorthodox opening tonight. And as I was putting this presentation together, I wanted to draw on some aspects, at least in my past and background, that I think really provided me with an appreciation and even a baseline understanding about what it means to embrace historic preservation. Growing up, I had this image that historic preservation equates into museums. So if we're going to save a structure, it's going to be saved to be a house museum where children go on field trips, where we go and we visit while we're on vacation. but we don't actually use those structures. And while that, at some point in our past, was a model for preservation, it's a model that has, I think, lost a bit of luster. And since tonight's topic is preservation moving forward, the future of preservation, I do think that it's going to continue to be probably a much more tangible and accessible version of preservation. So with this in mind, I'm going to show, and please bear with me, I'm going to go through, I think there's maybe 10 of these slides. We'll go through very quickly. There's no text. It's only an image. And I would like for you to think geographically where these structures exist. And there's a lollipop if you get them all correct. So here's our first one. Not far. Okay, ready for the next? Maybe we should give the answers as we go through so we don't forget. So this structure, any good guess? Massachusetts is a very good guess. This is Bennington, Vermont. We were just talking about Vermont. So this is the church right as you enter Bennington would be from the west. Ironically, or maybe not ironically, but interestingly enough, this is the church where poet Robert Frost is laid to rest. Guesses? Indiana. It is Indiana. Good job, Mr. Corby. This is in Indiana, not too far from where I grew up. This next one is a bit more difficult, but we'll see how you do. It could be anywhere, but. It's not Florida. No, Oak Park's a good guess. This is supposedly the classic California bungalow. The classic California bungalow in Southern California. So. Massachusetts. This is in Cape Cod. Cape Cod. New Orleans. Good. Don't look at the flags. That'll give it away. This is in Yellowstone National Park. This is Old Faithful Lodge. Santa Fe. Santa Fe. This next one is either tricky or unfair, depending on how you characterize it. So. Salem, Oregon. Who said Salem, Oregon? It is Salem, Oregon. Excellent. Excellent. Obviously, you know, I put this because there's one concept I will get into in a moment, where this concept that we call sense of place can be inherent, and it can also be created. And certainly, when this was constructed in the 30s in the Art Deco style isn't exactly exclusive to Oregon, but over time, the state capitol, located in Salem, Oregon, has become iconic for Salem, Oregon. The structure has become iconic. This next one is an insult to all your intelligence, but I'll show it anyway. This is the Deco in South Beach in Miami. This is a beautiful cobblestone located in Clarendon, here in western New York. The rationale for me providing some of this and going through that brief exercise is just because sometimes architecture provides a somewhat immediate identity to places. I would argue that most of you knew, at least generally, where those structures were located. We didn't do any research. We didn't have to read about any local history or heritage. We didn't have to interview anyone, and we didn't have to study any demographics of the community. But for some reason, we knew. And getting back to my early experiences, I think that as a young child, I sort of picked up on this, but I didn't know why. Why is it that the California bungalow might suggest California? Or why is it that the mail pouch barn has more of a Midwestern flavor and maybe a Southeastern flavor? Historic resources can help provide authenticity, pride, context, connectivity, and community substance. And the key word is help, because I want to be very careful this evening, and I want to be careful, I think, in my career, in not just simply suggesting that historic resources provide all of those following items and more. I think that preservation is one component in overall excellent community planning. It's not the only component, and it shouldn't be the only component, but I think it must be one, and I think it must be taken seriously. And I think these are some very, very powerful features that any community really needs. Not to belabor the subject, but I have to just go back and... So, Seattle Space Needle. I love this photo because immediately, when you saw the image, you knew this was Seattle. But I wonder if we removed the Space Needle, if we would have all known that it was Seattle. Probably not. And I have to show the connection between Rochester and Seattle with the Chase Tower, because this is designed by the same architectural firm. And here we have our beloved Pittsford. When we look at the resources in Pittsford that really provide those same characteristics, the context, the pride, the connectivity, we don't have a Space Needle in Pittsford, but we don't need one. What makes Pittsford unique and different and special and connected are the structures you already have. And as you move forward, it is important for you to help define as a community the new types of structures and new development that you seek to complement the historic resources. And that's what we'll talk about for the remainder of the presentation this evening. Planning activities. Preservation, again, should be only one component to overall excellent planning. And planning should reflect the kind of community that the citizens desire. So what kind of a community, what kind of a home do you want to live in? What kind of a place do you want to work? Where do you want your children to go to school, your grandchildren to go to school? And then realizing that you have to simply go and seek it. It doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen on its own. You have to seek it. And I will argue that actions create reactions, and those are both intended and unintended. But going through this presentation, I wondered, what if most citizens, though, essentially want the same kind of a community? Strong homes, strong real estate values for their homes, strong investments, businesses that thrive, and that includes local businesses, a sense of family and connection, excellent schools, celebrated culture, art, the list could go on. So what if people all seemed to gravitate to the same kind of community but had vastly different opinions on preservation planning? Well, that's not uncommon. And one reason, I argue, is because people truly don't understand the concept of preservation. I think if we can agree and have a common vision for the future, I think that the action steps in order to get to that vision really aren't as complicated as we all might think. I'm going to show you some examples. I was just mentioning to the Helfrichs where the Landmark Society takes travel tours, and this year one of our travel tours is headed to this community. Anybody know what this community might be? Savannah. This is Savannah. So I had to get our plug for our travel tour in this evening. This is Savannah, Georgia. If you look at these basic images of Savannah, there's a certain feel that one gets by looking at the images. If you've ever been to Savannah, it's a very different feeling that you get by physically being present in Savannah, Georgia. And you quickly also learn that Savannah, Georgia is pretty much unlike any other city in the state of Georgia that you can possibly visit. If you fly into Atlanta and then wake up the next morning in Savannah, you think you're on Mars. It's a very, very different place. These images that you're seeing, back to the previous point, Savannah doesn't exist in its current form just because it was haphazard. It occurred through careful and decades-long planning procedures that allowed it to be what it is today. So you decide what you want. What kind of community do you want? You recognize that appearance can relate to experience. And I think that's a critical point to remember. Oftentimes, I think we're all too quick to dismiss appearances. Appearances do not matter. Who cares about appearances? I was giving a presentation one time, and this was years and years ago. I made a comment similar to this, appearance can relate to experience. And this lady, in a very angry tone, said, buildings and structures do not matter, it's the people. And I would agree to a certain degree, but those people make decisions that impact the buildings, right? So appearances can relate, not dictate, but it can relate to experiences. So consider what action steps this community or any community will need in order to get there, to get to the point where you have the community like you envision, the community that you want. And then you simply implement that into your planning, and then action steps must align to this collective vision. I go back to this slide. This, again, Savannah, Georgia. If you've ever been to Savannah or know anything about Savannah, they have an incredibly strong preservation ethic. I would certainly be shocked if some folks in Savannah, particularly those who lived in the city and the historic districts, would wake up one day and walk down the street and walk by this beautiful fountain and say, well, we've made it. Now we can stop. You never stop. There's always the need to update your strategies, make sure that you're preserving what needs to be preserved, you're guiding new development. It's critically important. We talked about some benefits of historic preservation, I think at a conference. I was presenting at a conference a couple of years ago, and I focused almost solely on the economic benefits. I didn't want to neglect those economic benefits, but at the same time I wanted to add some cultural and some social benefits that we'll get to in a moment. But grants, tax credits, which by the way, in the intro it was mentioned I served on Preservation Action, which is our nationwide lobbying arm for preservation. And if you've ever used historic tax credits, we were very fortunate to have the historic tax credits preserved. In the massive tax reform bill that was recently passed, that was a very difficult, yes, thank you. And I'll show you some projects that utilize the tax credits, I think, in a little bit. But for now, grants, tax credits, heritage tourism. I mentioned heritage tourism in the sense of Pittsford because heritage tourism, unlike other types of tourism, doesn't necessarily rely on tourists from out of state or out of country or out of region to come into your community. Heritage tourism means that I could come down to Pittsford and spend the day on the canal and go shopping and have lunch and dinner, and I'm a heritage tourist from Brighton. So heritage tourism is very important, and the key though is you have to have something to come and visit. You have to have something that's unique. I'm probably not going to come to the Pittsford McDonald's versus going to the Irondequoit McDonald's. It's all the same. So we need to focus on unique experiences to draw people in and to keep people. Preservation creates a setting for compatible construction and development. New construction and development that's compatible. And it creates the setting because oftentimes the first step in revitalizing a neighborhood, a district, a city, or a town is through the preservation and reuse of its historic buildings. Then what typically happens, and we've seen this throughout the past 6-7 decades, is that once the historic districts are stabilized and thriving, then it becomes ripe for new investment to enter the community. And that can be certainly a positive, and it can also be an excruciating negative. That's up to you, and that's why you're going through this process. Preservation can stabilize and most often increase real estate values. It keeps real estate values in check more often than not, provides the local units of government a stable tax base on which to draw. There's an increased opportunity to support local businesses because local businesses tend to be much more smaller. And so if you have, in preservation commercial districts, just like Pittsford's an excellent example, small, locally owned businesses where those dollars you spend stay right here in the community. You have more opportunity for that in Pittsford than many other places, and you should be proud of that. There's increased marketing opportunities for your community, and you can attract a diverse population, both racially and across the age spectrum. I pulled a couple of slides from a survey that I've found very interesting that was completed last year from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They hired a research consulting company to interview, among other populations, they interviewed millennials. So this question is focused on millennials. The question is, personally, how important is the preservation, conservation, and protection of buildings, architecture, neighborhoods, and communities? I find this remarkable, not really surprising too much, except I was surprised to see those two numbers. So if you take a look at very important, 61% of millennials suggested that this is very important to them. 35% said it was somewhat important. And if you combine it 3 and 1, so 4% said it's not too important or not important at all. If your community is looking to attract the future, you really should focus on making sure preservation is an integral part into your community's planning process. The next point is that authenticity matters. This was another takeaway from that same study performed by the National Trust. So music, locally sourced food, handcrafted items are personal interests as well as ways millennials are interested in engaging with our history and culture. More than half of millennials prefer to shop or dine in unique or historic downtowns versus chain restaurants or shopping malls. This is very different from how my parents grew up. But we must recognize these trends. And in all fairness, I'm not suggesting that we never ever build another shopping mall. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I'm suggesting there is a balance, and I'm suggesting that there is compatibility, and there really must be a focus on where we see the trends moving. And the trends, folks, moving forward are high density, walkability, high livability standards, and authenticity. And authenticity is anchored in historic preservation. Preservation is a component of economic revitalization, and we don't have to look very far. It's taking place in downtown Rochester. I don't want to go into that. That's a separate PowerPoint all on its own. If you've been following the news at all with downtown Rochester, I realize it's a completely different scale than the small village of Pittsford, but if you look at downtown Rochester, I should remember the number, but it's over $1 billion of investment taking place in historic structures in downtown Rochester. I just dropped a few photos. And so each one of these, I mentioned the tax credit program, each one of these projects utilized the historic tax credit project. The upper left image is the Hilton Garden Inn on Main Street. This is the old National Clothing Building. It was vacant, boarded up. The upper right is the terminal building, which is being adapted now for housing. Lower left, that's Patrick Dutton, who's a local developer. That's the Bevier building, the old RIT building on the old RIT campus in Cornhill. And lower right's obviously Sibley's, a $200 million project undertaken by Wind Development in Boston. I thought I should probably have one project that did not use the tax credit program, and I thought, well, which one could I use? And I thought I'll go outside of downtown. So obviously this is the before photo. So this is the before photo of Station 55. This was Costanza Enterprises. This is over by the public market next to Railroad Street. I simply show this because I wake up every morning trying to preserve historic buildings, and I'm just going to be candid with you. You know, Bob, when I look at this, I just think, I don't know, maybe they should go to the next building. Well, look at it now. I mean, there's a waiting list of people wanting to live at this location. And if you speak to Jim or Drew Costanza, they will tell you face to face that people told them they had lost their mind and they were being a little insane to tackle that. But this is a topic that's not just unique, obviously, to Rochester and Western New York. These are planning practices that have been proven decade after decade after decade. One really unique story, we mentioned shopping malls. There was a proposal in this community back in, I think it was 1980, and if you see closely these sheets that are on this rope, and it goes, it's very difficult to see, but it goes, these sheets go to the end of this block, continues about halfway down the second block. And then, obviously it's not in the photo, but if you can just envision, it wraps around and includes another set of historic buildings on the other side. This was Asheville, North Carolina. And in 1980, there was a proposal to build a suburban-style mall in downtown Asheville. And this was supposedly going to be the way to revitalize a dead and dying Asheville, North Carolina. These people decided to get their ropes and their sheets to give folks in the community a visual depiction of how many buildings would be lost if this were to move forward. And it worked, or at least it worked in part. So it was not built, and today, downtown Asheville is thriving, and if you've been there or read anything about Asheville, it's continuously ranked as one of the best mountain towns in the United States. Real estate values, some would argue, are even way too high and increasing at a too high of a rate. And this is just one image from that time period in Asheville, the before and the after. Those are 3 buildings, each boarded up, completely vacant, and you have today, those are completely occupied. So that's job creation, it's housing, and maybe most importantly, for revitalization standards, this is money that's going right into the tax rolls. The top photo is a tax liability. The bottom photo is a tax producer, and that's important and that's key. I was down at, mentally was in the South when I was thinking of Asheville, and another city in the South came into my consciousness that I wanted to at least mention, and particularly because the Design Center will be speaking here. This is Greenville, South Carolina. And the Design Center did an excellent job by bringing in the mayor of Greenville and gave a fantastic presentation downtown last year. Greenville, South Carolina, and I apologize, I don't have any of the before photos, so you'll have to use your imagination. Greenville, South Carolina was a catastrophe back in the late 70s. I have family, and with my accent maybe it doesn't surprise you, I have a lot of family in eastern Tennessee. And I can remember, I had an aunt that lived in South Carolina. And I remember I was in high school, and for some reason we went through Greenville, and it was dismal. Greenville was a dismal place. And this has become a very famous urban revitalization story. And if you were lucky enough to hear the mayor speak last year, the one thing he said, he went through his formula for success. The first step in their revitalization, this is coming from the mayor, was number one, no historic building gets demolished. Period, end of story. Not one historic building is demolished. So we're starting our redevelopment efforts by making sure that we can all agree if there's historic buildings, they stay. These buildings get rehabilitated. Now, they didn't say that we weren't going to build any new buildings. Didn't say we're not going to have parks. It didn't say we're going to have some modern buildings. They did. They do. And you can see that in this image. There's some wonderful, in my opinion, wonderful, good design that takes place here. They really embrace their parks. They embrace their river, their falls. It's a completely different type of a community now. And this is their downtown in Greenville, South Carolina. Mentioning marketing, this should go sort of without saying, but to really focus on your heritage and preservation and use your heritage and preservation and what you have to help brand your community. So we have Brown's Race, High Falls, Lima, New York, Allentown and Buffalo, the Cornhill Historic District, and then I had to throw in the Fountain Street, the sign, because I love in Rochester the neighborhood street signs that really identify that you're in Swillburg. By looking at the street signs, you immediately see, oh, Swillburg, that's different than all the other street signs. It's unique. It's an embracing of that heritage. And then my favorite, though, is just the modest East Bloomfield sign. Welcome to historic East Bloomfield, home of the Northern Spy Apple. And then it goes a step farther because underneath it's sponsored by Canandaigua National Bank. So it just screams local. And I think that really is an interesting way to communicate that this is a place that matters to those people who live in East Bloomfield. So I promised I wouldn't just focus on the money and on the economy and the economic benefits, but there's these cultural and social benefits of preservation as well. Preservation offers a unique identity that's built on history and heritage. Preservation can be used to educate the community. It reflects a sense of community pride. It's an outdoor laboratory for public art, and I believe that architecture is the most public form of art. It's an art form that we can't escape. If you love art and you're a connoisseur of painting or sculpture, oftentimes you can go into the museum and you can look behind the displays and you can see behind the glass. But preservation and architecture allows you to interact with this public art. It's also sustainable. Preservation is very sustainable, it's walkable, and encourages a greater sense of personal interaction. I have in parentheses porches, we'll get to that in just a moment. So this idea of pride and something that matters and meaning and substance. We have a group of folks with the Landmark Society who call themselves the Young Urban Preservationists, and they affectionately refer to themselves as the YUPs. And this is a group of YUPs being very brave to go venture the chilly weather. And I think that's the Cliff Street Brewery in Rochester, which made its way on our 5 to Revive list last year. And the Yups took up a cause that really started in Buffalo called the Heart Bomb. And the Yups went around town in the region and took these photos with these hearts that said, "Love your city," or "This place matters." From an educational perspective, there's walking tours, there's all kinds of, again, heritage tourism opportunities. Back to the Yups, you see how the Yups do their educational programs. They have the bikes, beer, and buildings. So I think they're on their 4th annual building scavenger hunt. Entertainment, and yet educational. And then Rochester last year became part of what is called the Rust Belt Coalition. This is a group of young people who are dedicated to using preservation as a way to revitalize these communities in the Rust Belt: Cleveland, Detroit, I think Columbus, Ohio, Pennsylvania, some areas of Pennsylvania. And this is a group that met at in the Aqueduct in Rochester last year. So the concept of porches, sustainability, walkability. In our the Landmark Society's last 5 to Revive listing, we went ahead and listed the front porch on our 5 to Revive because we believe it's an architectural component that gets overlooked. It encourages interaction with our neighbors. It encourages walking. It burns, obviously, less fuel. But far too many porches are either enclosed or they're just simply ripped away. And we wanted to bring attention to that. And then the lower photo, you see the 19th Ward. Tree-lined streets, shade, cooling the houses in the summer. I was back we were back in the Midwest visiting family not too long ago, and we went to my old downtown. And we have 3 daughters. The oldest is high school, the youngest is in 3rd grade. And unfortunately, the downtown where I grew up in a place called Newcastle, Indiana, is virtually gone. It's now a small collection of historic commercial buildings, half vacant, with very large parking lots where no one parks because there's nothing to go to. So back in the 80s, it was the big cry was, let's tear down all these buildings so we can have more parking. So they tore down all the buildings. Now we have a bunch of parking with nothing to go to. And I can remember this last visit, I was telling my daughters, when I was really young, my mother would drive to downtown Newcastle. She would park in the parking lots that were behind the buildings, and we would spend the entire day in downtown Newcastle. I still don't think they believe me. Because what is there to go to? There's nothing there, and it's very difficult for them to even envision that there would be enough places in downtown Newcastle to actually visit and spend the day. So again, those unintended consequences, and we need to be honest with ourselves. The social benefits of preservation. This idea of authenticity, realism, healthy, livable cities, gathering places, a powerful sense of place, which is what I'm going to end with in a moment. This idea of connection through time across generation and ages, and a sense of belonging, a sense of place. Gathering places, these festivals. I think I just pulled some images. I think the lower left is Jazz Fest. I think the right is Fairport Canal Days. And then I believe that's the Cornhill Arts Festival in Cornhill. You don't have to have a historic district have a festival. It's just that it seems like a lot of them do. And again, what is it about that? What is it about the district and the architecture that sort of speaks to that festival to enhance it and to make our interactions more positive? Probably the most difficult theme that I've spoken about, and I sort of want to spend a little bit of time on and then end the presentation, is this concept of sense of place. Sense of place is one of those topics where you sort of know it when you experience it, but if you have to define it, it gets really tough to define what that means. What is a sense of place? So forgive me for reading this, but in case you can't see the text, a sense of place. So it's either the intrinsic character of a place or the meaning people give to it, but more often it's a mixture of both. So back to the Salem, Oregon, maybe it's not intrinsically Oregonian, but because of the context and the meaning the people have given that site, it becomes a powerful sense of place. Less striking places have meaning and value attached to them because they are, quote, home. And it is argued that attachment to a place increases with the distinctiveness of that place. So attachment increases with how unique it is. Planners use this argument by consciously creating or preserving memorable and singular structures to make a space distinctively different. So I believe that a powerful sense of place denotes not only what we were, so it's not just about our past, it's not just about studying history, but it's also about who we are and how we're living today in the moment. And it becomes a precursor to what we wish to become and what we really hope for our children, our grandchildren, and the future. And that's quite different than our thoughts of save the structure because I want to make it a house museum. That's a very different philosophy. Sense of place. I was really struggling as I was putting this together, coming up with some of, in my opinion, and in my experiences, some of the most meaningful sense of place locations. Anyone take a guess? Dallas. This is Dealey Plaza. This is obviously the location of the Kennedy assassination. I visited there twice, and I will never forget my first visit. I will never forget my first visit. I sat up by that's the sixth book, or the sixth floor, the school book depository building. And I remember sitting up by that building and not even being able to articulate what I was feeling. It wasn't really sadness, it wasn't excitement, but there was this powerful sense that I was somewhere that really held some deep meaning and a place that should be preserved.
Too bad it's missing its cornice.
Too bad. Yeah. Bob, you would be the one to notice that the building's missing its cornice. But I have to say, though, that I was thinking of this example, and I wanted to show you an example of a sense of a place that has really stayed with me. This is those classic, these are all over the Midwest, cement corner fence posts. And this is not far from where I grew up. And for me, this holds special meaning. I think there's a lot one can pull from those types of structures that are easily forgotten. But once they're gone, then we notice. And I think we should try to at least take notice before they're gone. I think one of the last examples I have, I'm going to go back to my Indiana days again. I was asked, I believe in 2007, to write an article about the High Street United Methodist Church in Muncie, Indiana. That's the High Street United Methodist Church in Muncie. And I was asked to write this article because I was told there was a devastating fire in 1978, and the congregation voted to restore the church and not demolish the church. That was basically all I knew about this church when I went there. So I went in the church, I met with a gentleman who was the archivist for the church, and he told me all about this fire. And what I didn't know was that in 1978, the fire occurred at the height of one of the worst blizzards on record in the state of Indiana. I don't know what the temperatures were, but this church caught fire. It was a gas explosion. But it gets worse. If you can believe it, it gets worse. The explosion lifted the roof structure up. The roof structure then fell back down onto the building and buckled all of the supporting columns all the way through into the basement. So now we have massive structural issues, fire, and obviously extensive water damage. So going back to my Station 55 thought, I'm a preservationist through and through. I have to be very honest that I probably would have said, I think you might want to build a new church. The congregation voted the next Sunday to actually preserve this building. And here it is today. And this gentleman who was the archivist, I asked him, I said, well, where did you meet during the restoration process? This was woefully underinsured. The congregation had to raise money for 3 years to pay for it. And I said, where did you have service during the restoration? He said, we had services at Muncie Central's auditorium, the high school's auditorium. I said, well, how was that? And I've never forgotten what he said. He said it was fantastic. It was wonderful. It was kind of them. We were able to have our services while the church was being restored. But you know, we were so happy to get back into our church building and our sanctuary. And I said, why? What made you want to go back? And he said, without missing a beat, this gentleman said, because when you sit in our sanctuary, you don't have to be reminded why you're there. And I think that is perhaps the best way to explain sense of place. That it's undefinable, it's almost difficult to even comprehend, but there's something that just tells you it's there and you notice it. This is called the Roots Blower Company, and this was abandoned. This is again, another example from my days in Indiana. This was abandoned, it had been vacant for 40, 50 years, and it was rehabilitated into an arts and science center for the community. They needed to raise a lot of money to restore all of these windows. And I went to a fundraising event, and I was walking up, I don't know, on the 4th, 5th floor, and a really elderly gentleman was walking around, wood floors, completely empty. The entire building was completely empty. And I got to talking to this man, and I said, are you from this area? Do you like this building? He said, you know, I worked in this building. I worked here for 35, 36 years. I said, oh, where did you work? And he said, I worked right here. I said, yeah, where? He said, right here. and he stood. If you've been in these manufacturing facilities, some of you I'm sure have, you know the yellow safety lines that are drawn around workstations? He stood in this yellow, this designated area, and he starts pointing and he says, Bill worked over here, and my friend so-and-so worked over there, and he ran this machine there. And I remember on the day that this occurred, I was standing here. This guy got really emotional. And he said, of all those people, I'm the only one left. And this is important to me. This project is important to me. That's a sense of place. I think that has a very powerful, personal sense of place. And if we can figure out how to take that kind of power for a structure like this and embody it into our communities, there is no end to what our communities can become. The final word then, remember to plan for the community that you want. Define what type of a place, where do you want to be? Every community is different, and each is at a different stage in its evolution. So Pittsford is not going to be like Brighton, and Brighton is certainly not going to be like any other place. Set your action items and policies that will produce that type of a community. You will never be done. It's never over. You've never achieved success and you can just go home and be lazy. It doesn't work that way. The reason is because when I said that sometimes preservation makes areas, communities, districts ripe for investment, obviously the very same hard work and dedication that is leveraging the new investment can be the very same force that destroys what is creating the wealth in the first place. So keep that in mind. The concept of ownership and property rights, in my view, should be a complete concept. It impacts all citizens. View preservation's tangible and intangible benefits within an economic, cultural, and social frame of mind. So, preservation, mostly I focus typically on these presentations on the economy and the economic benefits. But there's those intangible benefits I don't think that we should ignore, like those sense of places. That's all I have. I want to say thank you for your attention tonight. Thank you again for the invitation, and congratulations to your past work and the work that you're doing in the future here in the village of Pittsford. You have something to be very, very proud of.